Okay, we are live now. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I can see people are starting to join, so we'll give a few more seconds to everyone to make sure that the system works well. I see numbers are ticking up, so we'll keep them ticking up until we have the satisfactory number, and then we'll kick off. We have close to 100 registrations today, of which 29 or 30 are in the call already. Ticking above 30 right now. And whilst people join, maybe we can do a couple of brief introductory statements. So today's topic is about recent trends in foreign investment control. It's hosted by the IPBA, the Indo-Pacific Bar Association, specifically the Cross-Border Investment Committee. It's an initiative that was developed by Anselm Christiansen of Gleis Lutz, who's in this call right here. My name is Jan Burgaert. I'm a partner at Stibbe in Brussels. I'm a vice chair of the Cross-Border Investment Committee, and I'll be moderating this panel today. We have a few very fine panelists here. I'm pleased to say we have a very balanced panel too, not just in terms of geography, but also in terms of gender, which is great. I'll introduce the panelists in a minute, but before that, we're pleased to have the actual leadership of the IPBA here today. Importantly, we have Rhonda, who you can't see, but who's lurking in the background and who's been super instrumental in setting up this panel and certainly the technology behind it. So Rhonda, thanks for that. So far, it's functioning fantastically. Even more importantly, we have our president here, Jack Lee, who's been leading the IPBA for the past year and a half, if I'm not mistaken, through some very difficult times. We all know the current situation across the globe. We've had the Shanghai conference, which was cancelled, or at least delayed until next April, hopefully. We'll have Jack say a few introductory words, and we'll then move on to the panel discussion itself. So, Jack, please do go ahead.
Thank you, John. My dear brothers and sisters, dear distinguished guests, I'm glad to have this opportunity on behalf of the Indo-Pacific Bar Association, IPBA, to thank all of you to join our IPBA webinar at this special moment. COVID-19 virus has been spreading out around the world, but the virus cannot stop our mutual communication. Today, our seminar focuses on the recent trends in foreign investment control, a global perspective. Thank you all, the moderators and the speakers, for your great efforts in organizing a very special webinar today. We all know the COVID-19 brings plenty of efforts for the global trade. However, through our tireless efforts, the world trade has revived sharply. For instance, China International Fair for Trade and Service was held in Beijing this September, and the conference attracted thousands of companies from all over the world. The first Shanghai Bund FinTech conference was successfully held last month. And the seminar on the legal service for the Shanghai International Financial Center was held 3 weeks ago. The third China International Import Expo will be held in Shanghai next month. Hence, I believe the whole world will back on track very quickly. Next April, Shanghai will host IPBA 30th annual meeting and conference at the Bund of Huangpu River from April 18 to April 21st. We are looking forward to meeting with all of you in Shanghai. Before closing my opening remarks, I would like to share with you our first IPBA conference song titled We Are Together. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack, for the introductory remarks and also the musical intermezzo. We'll be very much looking forward to hearing more of you and seeing more of you, hopefully in April next year, so as to avoid having those kind of virtual seminars or webinars rather, and to be able to do those kind of interactions in actual person. We have tried, or we will try, to keep the webinar with a bit of interactivity with the audience. So we will launch a couple of polls throughout the process so that the attendees who can hear us but who we can't see, that they can participate to the webinar. Before that, I need to introduce the panelists that you will see. I'll try to do it in the order as they appear in front of my eyes, at least. So first we have Zhang Ying. Ying is a partner. Hi, Ying. You are a partner of Junhe in Beijing, specializing in cross-border M&A, foreign direct investment, and general corporate matters. And she joined the firm about 2 decades ago. Next, we have Anselm Christiansen from Gleiss Lutz, who is an M&A lawyer and a member of Gleiss's Asia practice, which means that Anselm specializes in cross-border M&A transactions with a focus on inbound transactions into Europe from investors or by investors from South Asia and Southeast Asia, rather, and East Asia, as well as investments in Asia from or by German businesses. And clearly that has led to a lot of foreign investment control cases, which Anselm will be entertaining us about today, together with the other panelists, including Ben Smith, who is Aussie and a partner at Minter Ellison in the Sydney office. Ben leads Minter's North Asia practice and advises clients from that region, North Asia, on their investments and M&A deals in Australia. Ben's been with the IPBA for a number of years, since 2014. And I can see, Ben, that you've changed a bit since last time we saw you in real life. So just only for that, we're looking forward again to Shanghai 2021. Next up, we have Hiroko. Hiroko is a partner at Nishimori and Asahi in Japan, with a broad range of experience in cross-border business transactions, including M&A, joint ventures, and business alliances. Hiroko was actually engaged in the discussions on the recent amendments in Japan to the foreign investment control regime as a committee member of the Council for the Ministry of Finance. And she has extensive experience in advising on Japanese foreign direct investment laws. I've been checking with some independent sources who have been telling me that Hiroko is in fact the #1 lawyer in Japan for that topic. So we'll be very much looking forward to hear what she has to tell us about the foreign direct investment regime. And last but not least, a bit closer to Europe, we have Kasturi, who is based in India at Trilegal's Bangalore office. Her primary areas of practice are M&A and private equity. She's been actively involved in several high-profile transactions, both inbound and outbound, and joint ventures, including in regulated sectors. And she also serves on the board of Trilegal, of the Trilegal firm. We've set a rule today that nobody should be talking for more than 2 minutes at a time. So by that token, I have already transgressed my own rule. We will first, Rhonda, if you're listening, we will first launch a poll to see and check with the audience how much the audience has or has not already been involved in foreign direct investment control. So we have a poll, which I think, there it goes, appears on the screen. Fairly simple. Does your jurisdiction have a foreign investment control regime? Yes or no? So for those who are attending and listening, if you can just participate to the poll, and then I think the results should show up more or less by themselves. This is really just a sense for us as panelists to get a sense of how much this is actually relevant to your own individual practice. I'm not sure how the results will show up, but they will in a minute. And there is a second poll, whether or not you have been involved yourselves in transactions that did not go ahead because of a foreign direct investment control regime. So Rhonda, if you could also launch a second poll, maybe show us the results. There you go. So the vast majority of us here present do have a foreign investment control regime, which is, I'm not sure whether that's good news, but at least it's relevant. So that's an 80-20. Rhonda, if you could launch a second poll, because that's already very useful to know. There's a second poll on we have been advising, whether you, the participants, have been advising, there you go, on a transaction that did not go through for reasons of FIC. So again, we'll leave this poll open for, let's say, half a minute or so. I will then kick off. We might want to kick off regardless of the outcome of the polls, and I'd like to give the floor maybe to Anselm, who's the initiator of this webinar here today, with a first topic, which is about the trends and applicability of FDI regimes, and in particular, whether there are any particular industries which are more or less prone to foreign investment control in Germany, in Europe, and maybe even in other jurisdictions. We don't have a French lawyer here today, but we all know that France is a particularly sensitive jurisdiction. We have the polls coming in, and I'll maybe let Anselm discuss those as part of his opening remarks.
Thanks a lot, Jan. I'll be very happy to do that. Actually, this poll question was also my idea, and I'm a bit surprised actually, because I would have expected answer number D to be the vast majority. At least I think, from a German practitioner's point of view, Germany doesn't publicize the cases where cases do not go through for reasons of foreign investment control that have been filed. But I'm fairly sure that most M&A lawyers will not have worked on a transaction that has actually failed. But it seems that globally, the experience with that seems to be even more negative than I would have expected, which is probably for a number of reasons. But I find that quite striking. As you were referring to the control scheme that applies here in Germany and in other parts of Europe, Germany has had a foreign investment control scheme already for 15 years in its basic shape that it is now since 2009. We have always had basically an approval scheme for very sensitive industries in the sense of military goods, war weapons, etc. And that has always been an approval scheme. For all other industries than military industry, for a long time, Germany has had a voluntary filing scheme, and nobody actually cared about it because in practice, it was never really relevant. You would maybe file for investment control together with merger control and on the basis of the same filing, but you would forget it. And then starting from 2016 and in the wake of Chinese investment into Germany, basically every half year, driven by certain transactions that the German regulator could not prohibit, we have had stricter regimes coming every few months. And by now we have a number of security relevant civil industries where, as of a few weeks ago, actually for closing an approval is required. That applies especially in certain medical technology sectors, critical infrastructure in the sense of grids and networks, in the food and beverage industry, media, certain IT topics in the financial sector, etc. So by now it's a very broad range already. And the trend is to actually further expand that catalog of sensitive industry by a category that we call critical technology. So that is probably going to include sectors like robotics, semiconductors, etc. Everything where the German regulator believes we have a competitive advantage that needs to be protected.
And I'll interrupt you right there because otherwise you will be transgressing the 2-minute rule. But I've heard a number of interesting topics there, including, the emphasis on medical items in view of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to switch to the other side of the world in Australia, which to European eyes has long been a jurisdiction that was focused, at least for foreign direct investment, was focused on natural resources. And I'd like to understand whether, one, that's still the case, but more importantly, whether the foreign direct investment regime is still focused on natural resources or has also expanded into technology, medical items, similar industries. Ben?
Yeah, thanks, John, and good evening, everybody. FIRB is now our foreign investment regime. We call it FIRB. The Foreign Investment Review Board is front and center of all M&A deals since March this year, when the screening level effectively came down to nil. So foreign investment approval needs to be obtained for most major M&A deals in Australia, certainly beyond the resources sector. The breadth is extremely extensive. It can capture now sort of offshore deals where there's a change of control offshore, but there's an Australian sort of subsidiary or some Australian assets. It's more extensive oversight for government investors compared to private investors. But just about every single deal that we work on now has a FIRB component. And look, I was doing a deal last week where the Australian component was about 2% of the global deal, and the US sort of lawyers sort of complained that our FIRB regime was a lawyer employment program, given that it's so extensive. So if you're doing a deal with a foreign client in Australia, you need to factor in a long timetable, potentially up to 6 months, to get your approvals. So that's a very significant change in the last 6 months.
Okay, and long timelines and administrative expenses are something that we don't typically associate with Australia. There's a number of other countries that we think are a bit more, have the more reputation of being administratively cumbersome. And I see Kasturi is laughing, so I'll switch to her to see how that is the case in India.
Okay, I shall respond to that charge. No, actually, we've as a country, of course, you are right. It is, we've always had a regime which has been a lot more strict in terms of how foreign investment has been seen. And we were kind of going the other way of the tide, where a lot more of the sectors were actually being opened up to what we call as the automatic route. So even till last year, and even actually this year, we've had a major shift in terms of a sector like the defense sector, which used to be within the 49% route, has now been allowed up to say 74 under the automatic route. So therefore, India has had a bit of a strange position on this. It seems to be opening up in various cases, but certainly, the rules with regard to investment from neighboring countries, and particularly, I think, in light of what has been happening during the COVID times, is something that has changed our position ever so slightly. And now the investments from these countries are under a special lens. There is still a lot of uncertainty in terms of how these rules are going to play out. But given that we have a long, deep history of actually very extensive review of each and every application which comes in front of the government, we don't expect it to be that different from what Australia is doing, perhaps, Ben. So, maybe not 6 months, but certainly in some cases, we could see up to 3 to 4 months in terms of the actual time for the government to take a stand. And these include not just the security clearances in terms of the investment itself, but even the officers and people who will be coming into India and taking up the managerial roles. So it's a very comprehensive exercise by the Ministry of External Affairs and the Home Ministry. So yes, it is getting harder on the one hand and slightly easier on the other hand. So a dichotomy as always.
Yeah. So if I can summarize that, for the last 3 jurisdictions, the trend seems to be towards a tightening of the foreign investment control regimes. That's certainly the case in Europe and Australia, with more balanced approach or situation, I would say, in India. I understand the situation in China is very different, that we're actually opening up rather in China. We'll come to that in a minute, or we can actually do this straight away, Ying. So if you could comment on that, because we understand during the preparation for this call that you've mentioned that in actually, certain restrictions to foreign direct investment in China have been relaxed over the last year or so.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, indeed, it seems that China is going to a different direction. China used to have a comprehensive foreign investment control system. It used to, every foreign investment in China requires government approval. But starting from this year, January 1st, 2020, so generally, foreign investment does not require any government approval. So it will be treated exactly the same as the domestic investment. But for some sectors, it is totally forbidden to foreign investment. For example, some ways to deal with Chinese medicine. And also there's a negative list restricting some sectors to foreign investment, require a Chinese controlling shareholding structure. But in general, it's now totally open up. But one interesting thing is that very recently, just months ago, an introduction of so-called unreliable entity list. It's new law, and it's basically saying that if a foreign investment in China, but if it takes measures which breaching the normal market transaction and boycotting supply to Chinese companies, then China can take like tit for tat measures against that entity. It's still very general in principle. We haven't seen any entity to be listed, but it's many believe that this is the countermeasures and lay the ground for Chinese government to take countermeasures to like cases like what the US has done to Huawei, TikTok, and WeChat.
Right. Yeah, so there is a bit of tit for tat there, and we'll come to that in a second. Maybe before that, Hiroko, we've been talking about trends in various jurisdictions and the tightening of that. You've been involved in recent changes to the Japanese set of legislation. I'm not sure whether those have entered into force yet or not. But is there anything particular, maybe that's happening in Japan, which is not yet happening in other parts of the world, and that Japan could serve as a source of inspiration for, that you see is being discussed, is happening in foreign direct investment control?
Sorry. Yeah. Yes. As you mentioned, in Japan, we had a major overhaul of the foreign direct investment regulation, and the major point is lowering the threshold of the government review from the 10% shareholding to 1%, and also maybe it's a particular point of Japanese regulation is the new regulation now requires some approval for the exercising the shareholding rights. For example, the voting for the shareholders meeting for the appointment of the director when the investor wants to send their related person to their investee company. That's the major point. And also at the same time, the new regulation introduced some exemption rule. for their passive investors. So that's the major point of our new regulation.
Okay, and that's interesting. And is it an akin to, let's say, a fit and proper test for those directors, as you have in the financial industry, for example? So, does a Japanese regulator assess the qualities of the persons that would be appointed to the board of Japanese companies?
Yes, of course, the regulation is from the perspective of national security. So the involvement of some foreign investors as our company's director or auditors or director may affect some national security prospect or Japanese industry's wealthy, smooth operation of the Japanese industry. So the government wants to examine such impact. Yeah, but it's really hard. No, actually, it's very difficult to assess. So, yeah, in the shareholders meetings in last June, there is one case. Foreign investor proposed to nominate its founder as a director of some sensitive industries company, and it took but it was reported. The government took very long time to review and gave the answer very in the last minute answer. So we have to watch how it will be operated. So yes, it's a highlight of Japan.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we can wrap up the topic by saying that in most countries there are additional bars being put in place or additional hurdles for indirect investment, which to a certain extent is interesting for us as lawyers who specialize in cross-border M&A. But which may or may not also reduce the appetite of our clients for doing cross-border transactions. So we'd like to launch a poll here amongst the attendees. Rhonda, that's the third poll, whether or not we see foreign direct investment controls reducing the appetite for cross-border M&A. This is a very simple question. You can answer yes or no, or you can answer whether it's only for buyers of certain jurisdictions. So if you can just give everyone the time to answer that question, and then for the results to show up. The question here really is whether there is an elephant in the room, and if so, who that elephant is. And we do have in Europe a new set of legislation, a regulation at the European level that came into force about 11 days ago on the coordination of foreign direct investment, which was, we think, and people argue, mostly aimed against a certain country. And so if we can have the polls or the results of the poll show up, then we can have Anselm maybe comment on the elephant in the room. There you go. So I think we have a consensus here. Anselm?
Yeah, quite clearly, if you look at the history of how German foreign investment control evolved, I think really the key acquisition that went through and was discussed a lot in the German public was the acquisition of KUKA, which is a robotics manufacturer that basically supplies all the German automotive OEMs factories for the assembly of cars. And so when that was acquired by Chinese Midea Group, that was really an outcry in the public because people were afraid that German know-how and know-how that is sensitive to all of our automotive industry would somehow, belong to China going forward, and that this industry would be in the hands of China in terms of reliance of production capacity. And ever since then, there has been a number of transactions where the German government was trying to utilize the foreign investment control scheme to intervene with Chinese acquisitions of German businesses, but always they realized, okay, actually the law doesn't allow us to do that. So they were basically looking for other ways to interfere with these transactions, like funding other buyers, etc., that kind of thing. And what was always ensuing then was a subsequent change of the law that addressed the weak point in the regime that had not allowed the German government to prohibit that transaction. And that's been a trend. You know, you can look at several public cases. And from own experience in discussion with the regulator, I think there are two facets to this China thing. I think one is like the political view on this. And I think the other aspect that I would like to highlight is how Chinese investors, at least in Germany, often approach this kind of process.
Right. And on that same topic, maybe Ben, there's been a couple of well-publicized cases about Chinese investors wanting to buy large tracts of land in Australia, where foreign investment control has been used, talking about a number of years ago. Is that changing these days? Do you also see the foreign direct investment control being used for investments by other countries but China? How is the situation down there?
Yeah, thanks, Jan. Like, look, I think it's fair to say that that the ability for Chinese SOEs to get deals done in a quick manner in Australia has changed. It definitely is more challenging. It's probably a little bit easier for private Chinese investors to get their deals through FIRB. Certainly compared to other countries, you have to be a bit more organized, take a bit more time for Chinese clients. But having said that, I have been involved with deals with Japanese clients this year, which now with the review threshold of 0 has meant that deals which, you know, would never have seen the light of day for FIRB review for all countries have that degree of oversight. I think certainly in my experience, having been involved in some deals that unfortunately haven't got across the line, the interesting observation to make from a client perspective is that FIRB, in order to be successful for clients, is now changing from a situation where you filled in the form, sent it across to the FIRB review board and just waited for the answer. Is this an acquisition that's not contrary to the Australian interest? Now, you know, with the development of, you know, the geopolitical situation, my advice to clients is increasingly make sure that you have a political lobbyist on board. Make sure that you engage with FIRB even before you put your approval process in, to get a bit of a heads up as to, is this the type of acquisition or the type of proposal that would be accepted under the regime? Because once you've got your proposal in, it's very difficult to have meaningful dialogue and Q&A with the decision makers. So you almost have to take that out of the legal process, hand it over to the lobbyists. They can have conversations with people we can't, work out whether this deal might be one that can get through, and then switch back to the legal process. So for us lawyers, you know, here in Australia, you know, over the last 6 months, that's a big change on how we advise our clients to be successful with their approval processes.
Yeah, so you're essentially advising the clients not that you wouldn't advise them, but that they have to go to somebody else to help them out. But that sounds like a fairly sophisticated piece of advice there to for the clients to go to political lobbyists, to walk down the political machinery lane, and to preempt the formal process. Ying, that degree of sophistication is something which, for a number of Chinese companies, certainly the list goes, maybe some private equity funds, would be something that's palpable. From an outside perspective, it might be more difficult for SOEs to go through that process. How do you look at that from a Chinese perspective?
Well, indeed, I think it's, you know, in addition to the epidemic, this political environment adds to the difficulty for Chinese companies to do the so-called outbound deals. especially for SOEs. And for private companies, we have still seen the appetite, but it's it's first it's the foreign investment control as to the uncertainty of the deal. So how the client deal with the uncertainty, in a deal, we have seen that the seller ask for I think it's not market standard high break fee. So it's I think from the business perspective, they will compare that compare to do a domestic transaction and an international deal. What's the cost, the pros and cons? So it's I think in the short run, it will be definitely to slowing down the outbound deal transactions flow from Chinese investors.
Right. Okay. And you said a number of interesting things there. One is COVID, of course, and we'll come to that in a minute, but maybe also that in order to reduce the risk or to allocate the risk of not obtaining foreign investment control, people negotiate break fees. So maybe that's an interesting topic. So because that's a technical topic, how do you deal with that risk in share purchase agreements? So Kasturi, do you see that? Do people enter more into break fee arrangements, hell or high water clauses? How do you allocate the risk of obtaining or not obtaining foreign direct investment control between seller and buyer, for example?
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting point, and really can form a topic by itself for a whole hour, just given the complications that we're seeing around the world. In terms of break fees, I think certainly there is a much broader range of topics that are discussed as part of break fees. What really constitutes the event at which the break fee is payable by the parties. The complications around how actually the applications are to be structured. So along the lines of what Ben was saying, it's no longer just a legal process, but really quite an important one to understand from the regulator itself, and have consultation meetings with them to try and understand what are the types of issues that are likely to come up if and when the approval or the application is put in. So break fees certainly are going up. I think hell or high water clauses in the Indian context, we don't see that many at all. I think it's a complicated one when you're doing a deal in India. But of course, if it's an Indian person who's trying to bid for a European or an American asset, then certainly we are quite used to seeing them. And given the earlier regime when CFIUS was really never in play, and and other restrictions didn't apply, a lot of the corporates in India perhaps didn't care so much about it. But now with increase and heightened scrutiny around these matters, companies from India are also thinking quite strongly about deals which have hell or high water and break fee points. I think it's become a matter of weighing in the transaction risk. And a lot of the general counsels are being forced to stay awake at night, being quite concerned about these issues.
Yeah, no, interesting. And so you mentioned it, and Ben's been emphasizing it also, about the need for pre-consultation with the government. That's really key to success, and it's not just a matter of filling in the form and then hoping for the best. We have Hiroko here, who's not a regulator, but he's been involved with the Japanese government. So Hiroko, if you could maybe just share a few thoughts on that, how the regulator, how the government looks at that, and how the government would like those processes to take place and when it would want to be approached.
Same here in Japan. We do some pre-consultation with the government in certain the transactions for the critical or core sector. So yes, Yeah, but actually we have there is no formal regime for the pre-consultation, but they actually receive some our request for this consultation before we formally file the finding. Yeah, because in Japan the government usually have only 30 days to review, so we have in such case we do the pre-consultation.
Okay, great. Thanks, Hiroko. Now, clearly, as we can see, some of us are not sitting in the office because of the COVID situation. On that point, because it clearly affects practice and the way that we operate, but also the regulatory set. So there is a poll that you can launch on whether or not the global pandemic has actually affected the regulatory environment. So did your jurisdiction implement an FIC regime or amendments thereto, specifically in view of the COVID-19 pandemic? An easy yes or no question. Most of our countries are affected to certain degrees by the pandemic. We've all been in full or partial lockdown for a while. Until I understand it, in Germany, things are happening at regional level, lockdown or not, but from your opening remarks, I understand that changes have been made to the FIC regime. So we can close the poll and see what happens, but maybe you can comment first from a German perspective, and then overall in response, there you go. So we've asked the majority, which has amended its legislation. Anselm?
Sure. Yeah, I belong to the 58% here. Indeed, Germany has, in terms of applicability, fairly quickly expanded the scope of civil security relevant technologies that require now pre-approval by adding to that list of sensitive industries certain healthcare and medical technology items, particularly companies active in the vaccination research, hospitals, and the like. So that happened very quickly. Maybe also a bit with a view. There was public rumor about President Trump wanting to acquire a stake in one of the German leading researching companies on a COVID-19 vaccine, which, not being the elephant in the room typically, but faced a lot of resistance in Germany. And additionally, I think also on a procedural side, we have been involved in a fairly high profile case of foreign investment control, where we started the unofficial discussions prior to the pandemic, then sort of had first meetings and second meetings when the pandemic was already a topic and people weren't supposed to meet. And we did close the process during the mid of the lockdown in Germany. So we transitioned from a state of everything is quite normal into a state of we only communicate remotely with the authorities. And I gotta say, actually, I was a bit surprised that the process per se and the communication with the authorities maybe wasn't entirely as smooth, but it still worked.
Yeah, so at least the German authorities have adapted to the COVID situation and also have been working from home or elsewhere. And that's great. There in Japan, Hiroko, maybe switching on from COVID to, is COVID being used, or does it have the potential of being used as a convenient excuse for actually tightening the FDI regime? Or is Japan sophisticated enough to look at it on a more generic scale?
Yeah, it's I don't know whether they do use as an excuse to tighten the, but actually Japanese government added the infectious disease medicines in some high-level medical device manufacturing industry are added to the some core sector, which means the Japanese government review very strictly about the foreign direct investment. They introduced last July, so yes, same as German. they acted very swiftly. It
Yeah.
also, but in addition, the last year, the restricted business sectors were wide, very added, and also the securities and cyber security business industries are added last year. So now we have a very wide range of the restricted business.
Okay, sorry, I lost the connection for a while here. But this is the drawback of the current situation. But on that point, and I'd like to switch to Ben, maybe this is more of a policy point here, because you mentioned that the thresholds for foreign investment review have been lowered to almost $0, if I understood it well. In terms of striking the right balance, do you feel that's maybe a bit exaggerated? And how difficult is it for government to strike the right balance between, on the one hand, legitimate security concerns, and on the other one, as a relatively small jurisdiction, at least in terms of population, Australia must have an interest in attracting foreign direct investment. So how do you find the right balance there?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Maybe just to demonstrate how material that changes come through, like Australia negotiated a series of free trade agreements with China, Japan, and Korea in the last 5 years. We also have free trade agreements with the US and New Zealand plus Singapore. And generally, the level of those FTAs was set at $1 billion. So if you were a US investor investing in Australia, acquiring a greater than 20% interest in an Australian target, and you weren't a foreign government entity, there'd be no fair review unless the value of the target was less than $1 billion. And even sometimes, like if there was an Australian holding company in the middle, you might bring that down to the threshold of 275 million. But it was a meaningful threshold. And now that same investor looking to buy 20% or more of that target company, the review threshold is nil. So FIRB is completely overwhelmed. They've had to call in bureaucrats from all the different government agencies to help out. You get people from the tax department, people from our antitrust department, and they don't really understand how it all works. So there's an education piece that you have to bring people up to speed on. So it has really led to a complete slowdown. And, of course, Christmas is coming up. Clients want to get things done by Christmas and, have to lean on your relationships to get things done more quickly. Look, the balance is clearly out of kilter. It's unsustainable. It can't sort of go on sort of for the future. I think when the mythical vaccine arrives, when we all start jumping on planes to see each other in person, you would hope that these thresholds are revised. There's new legislation coming in on 1 January. You would hope that some commercial sanity will prevail, because at the moment the system is overwhelmed and it's difficult to get things done quickly.
Yeah, and I think that's been the trend throughout, this panel here, that in countries like Australia and certainly also the US and Europe, rules and regulations are tightening. We heard Ying explain that in China, it's both being tightened but also being opened. Kasturi, I suppose the situation is probably a bit similar in India, where it's a much more balanced approach between tightening foreign investment control, but at the same time opening up the country to foreign direct investment and trying to find a balance there.
That's right, Jan. As I was saying right in the beginning, foreign in investment is critical to growth in India, and that is a fact that no government can really shy away from at all. So bringing FDI into the country is highly critical at this stage, and especially with the COVID-19, the economic slowdown has certainly taken a huge toll on the population of this country. So bringing FDI in is critical, but putting in place serious checks and balances to make sure that the investment is coming in the right manner for the right reasons and in the right sectors, so to speak, is really the focus of the government at this stage. The circular that has recently come out, which has of course caused a lot of havoc, is the approval route for the investments which are coming in from the neighboring countries. That has really been a bit of a shift in terms of how FDI rules were being looked at in India, and typically this is a reaction to China, and for us China is has more than one meaning, because there is a standoff at the borders, there's issue with the virus itself, and various other geopolitical factors that do come into play. So these rules are extremely strict, and what has happened is that within the ministries there is a very it's an understated kind of a policy where it's like a distrust and verify. So they're basically the thought is immediately to not trust it, and therefore the verification process is an extremely long and arduous one. So as a result, unfortunately, I think there are 75 or 80 applications which are pending at this stage from China and Hong Kong, which have just not moved. And the government is not able to take a call on, well, whether it's not able to or doesn't really want to is a bit unknown at this stage. But there were thresholds which were being spoken of, which were 10% or 25%. But very recently, we've had some word from the cabinet which has said even one shareholding is bad enough, and so therefore, like Australia, it's a 0% kind of a threshold. This is causing a lot of uncertainty within the market, and I think at some point the government really has to give us an indication as to which way it wants to see this, because applications are not moving, deals have just gotten stuck, and companies in India which have got a lot of money in terms of Chinese funds and things like that, for them as well, they don't know which way to turn. So it's a really uncertain time.
Yeah. So I'm hearing uncertain times and also very complex situation with lots of stakeholders involved, which of course makes it difficult for the government to take it has to walk a fine line there.
Absolutely.
Maybe if we can look forward towards the next couple of months or years, there's a final poll here which wants to inquire about the participants' expectations for the future development of the FIC regime, and that ties well into what we have just been discussing for the last 5 or 10 minutes. Rhonda, if you could launch that one. So we'd like to know whether, there you go, we expect foreign investment control to become tighter or not, or whether it will focus on certain jurisdictions. We've been discussing the elephant in the room here today, or whether no changes are expected. And that will lead us towards an assessment of where we think, at least the audience here thinks, the world, or at least foreign investment control regimes, will be heading to, and whether it will become easier or more difficult to obtain such clearance in the months and years ahead. And whilst we close that poll, maybe Anselm, you as the instigator of this panel, you might want to have a couple of closing remarks. There you go. So a vast majority which believes it will be more difficult for foreign investors to obtain clearance. And I think that ties in well with what has been discussed on this panel today.
Yeah, indeed. I think this is probably the least surprising with the view to, if you have a lot of people from Europe on the call, probably that will predetermine that outcome. What I think, makes this particularly difficult to handle is you can, of course, like predict whether the regulators in Europe will widen the applicability of their regimes, etc. But I think, where we are coming from in Germany, and I think in a lot of Western industries, is basically a no restriction at all world, right? And then maybe in the 2000s or so, for state funds, etc., some restrictions were introduced. But we're coming from this WTO membership, basically trade is free world. And now we need a justification actually to restrict an investment. And I think at least in Germany, the standard still is security relevance and the threat to public order and security. But in practice, I think, that's actually quite limited, the relevance of these factors. What is being achieved by the regulator and by the authorities that you deal with in the process, to me, often way more seems like industrial policy, right? We do not want foreign investment in certain sectors. That is what the regulator says, and that's not necessarily what the industry itself says. But the German government, to an extent, seems to take the approach, in a wake of global protectionism, that they say we want to have the means to prohibit this, but under the international treaties, etc., that we are bound to, we can only justify this by arguing with national security, which seems a bit, taken from the tradition of the US here. And I think, this makes it so difficult to also grasp the issue for many foreign investors, because if you just look at the law, and if you look at what the German regulator should be asking you, if you look at the law, I think you only capture a very small percentage of what you actually need to take into account. And this is, for me, what makes it so difficult, to deal with this entire topic. And in the current world and the development of restrictions on international trade, I'm not so optimistic that this will become less challenging.
Yeah, so I'm hearing a bit of pessimism about the fact that it's becoming more complex, that the world is becoming less integrated, less global. There is more protectionism. I think we've all been experiencing that in the last, let's say, 5 years or so, if not before. I've heard you saying a bit about industrial policy, which is certainly the trend that's happening here in Europe. So it seems like the world is becoming more French. I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or whether there is. But maybe that's the conclusion of this panel here today. I think I see that we have spent, we have used the hour that was allocated to us. And I think that your closing remarks here, Anselm, sum up the panel discussion quite neatly. So before we close off, I'd like to thank, first of all, the IPBA staff, Rwanda, for setting up the infrastructure, which worked great. Jack, leader president, for his opening remarks. Of course, each of the panelists for their valued contribution to the panel today, and then the participants, the attendees, which have been listening and which have even asked a couple of questions, which I see now. Thanks for those. Sorry that we didn't address those. On that note, I think we can close the seminar. We will all be crossing our fingers to see each other in Shanghai in April, if not before. And until then, stay well and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot to you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ian.
Bye.
Bye.
Stay safe, everyone.